Hi guys, welcome back to the Revive Stronger podcast. I'm your host, as always, Steve Hall, and today I talk to my friend Dr. Greg Potter. And today we're talking about lifestyle changes, small lifestyle changes that you can make to promote better health and longevity. So a lot of you guys, including myself, will be doing the basics that are really, really good for promoting great health. For example, emphasizing our sleep, eating a nutrient-dense diet, lots of whole foods, trying to manage our stress, doing resistance training, maybe some cardio, keeping a high activity level. But what on top of that maybe are we missing that could have potent health benefits? So we talk about some nutritional diversity that we might be missing out on. We also talk about some various training techniques that might be helping emphasize longevity within the gym. And then we talk about some environmental changes. So that could be the benefits of giving blood, for example, which Greg has spoken at length at before, and also talking about microplastics in depth and how you can better manage those within our environment, because they do look like they're unfortunately accumulating and they aren't beneficial for health. That's for sure. So we dig into all of that. So lots of great take homes that you can move forward with practically and apply to your life to live better and healthier for longer. And guys, as a reminder, please do make sure to share this with anyone you think might benefit. Tag myself and Greg Potter, take a screenshot even, and put it over on your Instagram stories. That would be fantastic. Make sure if you are listening and you regularly listen, maybe you've listened to a few episodes, do subscribe. Really helps the channel and helps the podcast grow as a platform, and I can attract even bigger names within the podcast potentially and continue to bring on the amazing guests that I already get to have the opportunity to speak to. So do subscribe, give us a thumbs up, give us a great review, comment on YouTube if you're visiting over on there. I appreciate all of that support. But without further ado, let's get into the chat. So Greg, last time you were on, we were talking about the hallmarks of aging. We talked about kind of different rates of aging for different organs, the implications of that. We talked a bit about the importance of strength training for kind of independence in our later years and how many bodybuilders and strength trainees are setting themselves up for success in some ways. And we spoke quite extensively about some anti-aging supplements or some promising supplements that we might be able to use. And we wanted to also dig into some other topics, but as ever, we end up digging deep and talking for a while. So we've got this extra episode. Thankfully, you're kind of willing to spend the time to do that. So now digging into lifestyle changes. So love to hear about what might be some kind of small, easy modifications people could make to their lifestyle to help anti-aging. People, at least listening to the podcast, I think understand they're nailing their sleep for the most part. They're exercising, they have a relatively well-rounded diet. So the big kind of the stuff that I think people jump ahead of often in the Gen Pop, and they look for the fancy supplements and I don't know what it could be, the biohacking elements, and they're not doing the basics, like they're not getting their sleep in check. But a lot of the listeners will be. So I'd love to dig into some of those more kind of potentially more nuanced practices, but are relatively kind of low-hanging fruit for some people.
Absolutely. And I suppose we can think about this in terms of aging. We can also just think about simple, small things that you can do that are likely good for your health in general. And I'll try and touch on some that I think aren't that widely discussed. And part of the reason for that is just like you say, I think many of the listeners are likely already doing things quite well. They have the big rocks in place. And so some of this is filler, but the research suggests that it could add up to something meaningful over time. And I'll break it down into some different categories too. So if we begin arbitrarily with nutrition, then I think there are some simple things you can do in terms of the composition of your diet. Some of that relates to dietary variety. We need to bear in mind that within the confines of whatever diet you're on, which could be ketogenic diet, it could be a plant-based diet, it could be that you don't consume gluten. Within the confines of your personal diet and dietary pattern, I think more dietary variety is generally a good thing. Because if your dietary variety is low, then you're likely to get too much of certain things and not enough of others. And so assuming that you consume plants, for instance, I think when you shop buying mixed nuts as opposed to just almonds or walnuts is likely an easy win. Doing the same with herbs and spices, bearing in mind that by doing this, you're going to get a greater variety, in particular, of things like polyphenols, each of which have some discrete health benefits. And this also applies to things like grains if you consume grains. So rather than just consuming rice and oats, also intermittently consuming things like quinoa and so on might be advantageous to balancing your nutrition. And then when it comes to animal foods, the same applies. A lot of people focus on muscle meat in particular. It could be that you mostly consume chicken breast and beef mince and small amounts of lamb now and then. But if you can eat nose to tail, then that's going to be a good thing because different forms of offal or organ meats, if you're in the US, have distinct nutritional profiles. Some people have referred to liver, for instance, as being nature's multivitamin because it's enormously dense in some micronutrients, some of which are quite hard to get enough of from other foods. If that puts you off and the thought of consuming lots of offal is a bit icky, it makes your skin crawl, then you can always try and mask it. So let's say that you eat beef mince. You could cut up small amounts of liver and hide it in the beef mince. And if you're cooking for other people, then they don't even need to know that you've done that. But were you to add 50 grams per person of liver to 100 grams of beef mince, it probably wouldn't have a notable effect on the consistency or the taste of it, but it certainly would do on the nutrition. And I think this is also good for the environment and for minimizing waste because a lot of those cuts of meat might otherwise go to waste. And it is a serious consideration because some people are trying to reduce their consumption of some animal foods for environmental reasons related to emissions and whatnot. And I know that that's a polarizing subject, but if you were on board with that idea, then that is clearly an advantage of that way of eating. Plus, it's quite cost effective because things like liver and heart tend to be inexpensive, even though they're arguably among the most, if not the most nutrient dense foods that are out there. And then otherwise, I think an easy one when it comes to diet composition is just regularly consuming some probiotic containing foods. And we can consume small quantities of these, but the regularity probably matters. As is true of many things, it's true of strength training, for instance. I think it's probably better to consume some on a more frequent basis than lots less frequently. So let's say that you consume 500 grams of probiotic containing yogurt each week. It's probably better to split that into 5 100-gram doses on weekdays than to have all 500 grams once as a bolus on one given day. But that's likely to support the health of your digestive system and in turn various other organ systems too. So pause there, but those are some thoughts based to diet composition to start, which I think are really easy to enact actually. It really largely comes down to making some small changes to how you shop.
Yeah, I love that. I think there's actually been research done on, I think, competitive bodybuilders where bodybuilders are bad for it, where they like remove dairy and the diet becomes very restrictive and they are deficient in so many different micronutrients. And obviously, that's a dieting bodybuilder towards stage, but bodybuilders in general, and I include myself in that, love routine, love like a meal plan to follow. Even if a lot of the listeners and myself included follow a flexible diet, it's still to some extent restrictive, like my day-to-day eating. And I think many people's day-to-day eating is pretty samey. So just having that impetus from you, it's like, hey, simple things. Like you don't, when you buy nuts, buy a mixed bag and try and include like mixed veg, for example. That's something you can do. And the offal point that you mentioned is something I definitely personally have not. I don't know if I've ever eaten liver, not knowingly at least, but I have heard that in terms of it being like nature's multivitamin. So that is a good shout in terms of mixing it to hide it. It's something I think about with, I've had clients who struggle to eat vegetables. And so I'm like, how we make it into a sauce to be with a pasta, hide those, blend it up or whatever. So hiding that, I think that's a great point there. And a question that I had for you, Greg, actually on this, do you think, I imagine if you have a high amount of diet variety day to day, you could kind of have that consistently and that be okay. So say, for example, for me, I have probably combined 10 fruit and veg every single day, but those 10 are almost the same day to day. Am I doing a pretty damn good job and almost 99% of the way there? And so for the listeners, if they already have a very varied diet, but it's the same every day, they're probably doing a pretty good job.
I think you likely are. I think the degree to which that's the case probably interacts with what your choices of those are. What I mean by that is just imagine a situation in which you're consuming 5 fruits each day and 5 portions of veg, but all of the 5 fruits are citrus fruits and all the 5 vegetables are brassicas. In that case, the variety of different chemicals that you're getting from your nutrition will be much lower than if you were consuming, let's say, some berries, some citrus fruits, some stone fruits, and some root vegetables, and some brassicas, and some of one other type of vegetable. Does that make sense?
Oh, yeah,
So
completely.
if you do want to be very consistent with your food choices, and I understand that there are different considerations depending on the individuals. So take the example of physique competitors who are tracking their nutrition religiously to hit their macronutrient targets. For simplicity, you might find that you rely on certain items quite consistently. That's fine, but maybe rather than just going for apples, bananas, and oranges, instead making one of those choices mixed berries from the frozen section is going to be a good thing, because even though you're actually just picking the same one item every time, you're getting more variety within that item. So the short answer is most likely yes, but there would be exceptions to that rule.
Is this where the idea of having kind of like a colorful plate comes in, where people talk about like eating plenty of different colors and that? Because obviously, I guess I've forgotten the word for it, but green vegetables are very much like your sprouts, your broccoli, like they're of a certain type and ilk, whereas then you get your peppers that are like red and yellow, and you get your tomatoes. So that kind of, rather than people having to think about all the different types of root vegetable versus like other vegetable, lots of fruit and veg that is colorful is probably doing a good job.
Yeah, and I imagine that someone listening to this is rolling their eyes at the moment and saying, "Oh yeah, you got to eat the rainbow." Many of us have heard that for most, if not all, of our lives. But there's some truth to it, just because the colors correspond to the phytochemicals in the plants. And so the more colorful your diet is, the greater the diversity of those different phytochemicals that you're getting.
Yeah, love that. Yeah, that makes so much sense. I don't know if there's anything else on that topic you wanted to cover, or you can move on to.
I think there are probably some considerations depending on whether someone is trying to navigate a particular health condition. Just as one example of this, a simple dietary swap that you could make would be switching regular sea salt or rock salt for a low sodium alternative, salt substitute. It's the chlorine, the chloride, that gives salt its salty flavor rather than the sodium. And so you can displace the sodium by potassium. And when you do that, you tend to push down people's blood pressure. And there's something of a dose response relationship. The blood pressure is a huge driver of different chronic diseases, in particular cardiovascular diseases, but it's true of other diseases too. And so for people whose blood pressure tends to run a bit high, just going for low sodium salt substitutes is an incredibly easy win, because they taste much the same. They'll probably reduce their blood pressure by several points. The systolic number more than the diastolic number, the first number in a blood pressure reading the higher number more than the lower one, but that's expected. So that would be a really, really easy win too. And then otherwise, in terms of nutrition, I think another simple change that people can make, which we've spoken about previously, is just considering dietary timing. And many people will already be thinking about this within the context of the day, but thinking about it within the context of the meal or snack can be helpful too. Just because if you save carbohydrate dense items for the end of an individual meal or snack, you'll tend to have a lower blood sugar response to it. And much of the time, that is a good thing if someone has pre-diabetes, for instance, or type 2 diabetes, then that's going to be good. But there are also instances in which someone might actually want the large blood sugar spike. This is especially true of certain types of athletes. If you're training twice a day and you're trying to replenish your muscle glycogen stores ahead of the second session of the day, then you might want quite a big glycemic swing in response to your post-workout meal after the first training session. And so actually having the carbohydrate first from a performance vantage might be beneficial. So it depends on the context, but just manipulating when you consume the highest carbohydrate items within the meal or snack, if it's practical, can be quite helpful. It's not always practical, but let's say that your carbs are coming from fruit. That's quite easy to save for the end of a meal. Whereas if you're consuming a mixed meal, let's say it's pasta and some sort of meat, it might be less straightforward in that instance, and you're naturally going to combine those.
Makes sense. I have two thoughts on this. One, just on the salt question. I have a couple of thoughts on that. One is it worth, this is something I've done for a number of years now, is purchasing a salt for someone with healthy blood pressure and doesn't need to kind of use the low salt variety. Getting a salt that is supplemented with iodine. Is that something that you think is worthwhile?
Yeah, it's a great question. It interacts somewhat with your nutrition and with your health status too. So just take the example of someone whose thyroid function is running a bit low because of iodine deficiency or insufficiency. If that's the case, then adding iodine to sea salt, so those types of fortified salts, makes complete sense. And in some parts of the world, that is the norm. You'll go to some countries where almost all of the salt that you buy off the shelves has iodine added to it. In other parts of the world, and I think this is true of the UK, that's not usually the case. If your existing diet is varied and you get plenty of iodine from it, then you don't want the extra iodine. That's not going to be good for you and it could be detrimental. So it's somewhat context dependent. And in general, the lower quality your diet and therefore the lower your iodine intake, the more likely iodized salt is to be a good thing for you. And if your diet is very restricted, so let's say that you're one of the 5 people out there on a carnivore diet and you're not consuming much iodine, if that's the case, then using iodized salt would probably make a lot of sense for you. That's just one example, but various different types of dietary restriction would reduce your iodine intake.
It might be that I'm not requiring it. I don't know where I read about it, learned it. There was along the lines of soils are depleted of iodine, so you're not getting what you think you were from the kind of vegetables and fruits, and so getting an iodinized salt is like a no-brainer. I've been using it for years now, so at least I've not felt the ill effects if it is doing something that's not great. But
maybe that's part of your secret to getting so lean on the stage. Your thyroid's in overdrive because of your iodized salt.
The other question is, in our bodybuilding community, but I think it's wider than this, pink Himalayan sea salt. Is this the greatest salt you should be consuming?
No, it's a marketing gimmick. Next question.
Yeah, this is actually, that might come into, I was almost going to save it for our overrated, underrated. So yeah, overrated. That's fantastic.
Yeah.
And then, yeah, your point on kind of when to eat certain foods, is that similar to someone who maybe has struggled controlling their blood sugar levels? If after a meal they were going for like a 10-minute walk or like an exercise snack, they're getting that similar like benefit, like it's maybe double downing on saving carbs till last.
Yeah, there are several things that people can do that will consistently reduce their blood sugar responses. One of them is going for a walk, probably ideally of at least 15 minutes based on the literature, and ideally as soon as possible after eating. The timing really does matter in that instance. Obviously, that depends on how quickly you eat and so on, but the more slowly you eat and the longer the interval between finishing eating and walking, the less likely it is to have an effect on how the meal impacts your blood sugar. But yes, getting outdoors, having that postprandial walk will reduce that blood sugar swing. But then there are some other things too. Obvious ones are reducing your carbohydrate intake. Also within that meal, increasing your fiber intake, increasing your protein intake, increasing your fat intake, all of those will push down the blood sugar response, controlling for everything else. And then timing within the day has some effect too. And in general, this is certainly true of relatively healthy people. People's blood sugar responses to the second meal of the day or later tend to be reduced by having consumed a prior meal. However, for the most part, people's responses to the final meal of the day, particularly when it's consumed very late in the biological day or even during the biological nighttime, tend to be much greater. Various reasons for that, which I think we've probably discussed previously when speaking about chronic nutrition. But based on that, having a lowish carbohydrate final meal, if reducing blood sugar excursions is your goal, does make some sense. It doesn't always make sense because in people with healthy glycemic control, having quite a high glycemic load final meal can actually help with restorative sleep and potentially with recovery before next day exercise performance and possibly even with cognition the next day. So there are nuances to that. But if you're trying to keep your blood sugar in check, then having a lowish carbohydrate final meal is going to be advantageous. And then otherwise, the usual things like getting enough high quality, regularly timed sleep is going to help with your blood sugar control. And then some things that are good for you in the short term are going to be bad for your blood sugar control. For example, doing very high intensity exercise is going to push up your blood sugar. However, if you look at the integrated response over time, let's say over the next 48 hours or so, in general, the area under the blood sugar curve will be lower after exercise because you've got greater non-insulin mediated glucose uptake into the skeletal muscle. So exercise is good for you.
Excellent. Yeah, I think you did a good job of just confirming to the listener, as I would say the average listener is probably not too dissimilar to either of us, Greg. Like, they are following those basic practices. They haven't got any kind of health conditions need to be worrying about, so they probably don't need to worry about some of those more nuances in terms of like the order of which they eat and making sure they go out for a postprandial walk and that sort of thing. They probably have good regularity in their blood sugars generally.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
Awesome. So yeah, nutrition, I think there was a lot of good stuff there. I guess I don't know what's next on your list.
It can be anything at all, but let's go with training. And training is a difficult one because I think many people listening to this have strong opinions, already know a lot about training, training for specific goals, probably training very intelligently relative to most other individuals. However, I think there are a couple of training methods that aren't that widely discussed that can be really helpful. One of them that I've mentioned to you before, Steve, which just fell by the wayside largely for no good reason, was popularized by a guy called Charles Staley. Some of us of our age grew up reading Teen Nation in our teens, and Charles Staley was an author at Teen Nation. That's probably how many of us came across him. And he had this method that he called escalating density training, where you set a time zone for a given exercise, and then you do as many reps as possible for that exercise within that time zone. And it works particularly well with single joint exercises. So let's say that you're doing preacher curls for your biceps. You could start with 5 minutes of preacher curls for your biceps with a 12 repetition maximum. And for your first set, you'd get close to failure, but not go to failure. So maybe you'd have 2 or 3 reps in reserve. And then every minute or so, you'd crank out a few more reps. Part of the reason why I like this method so much is that controlling for time, you will do more reps than you would doing straight sets of the exercise. So using a 12 rep max in the preacher curl in that 5 minutes, if you did 2 sets, you might get 23 reps, 22 reps. Whereas using the 5 minute time zone, you'd probably get close to 30. So your total volume per unit of time will be higher. But also, I know in recent years, the concept of effective reps has been one that's gained a lot of traction and a lot of discussion. you'll do more effective reps during that time too. A greater proportion of your reps will be closer to failure as a result of that. So I think it's a great method. It works incredibly well, in particular for muscle hypertrophy, probably a little bit less so for strength gains, but most people listening to this are probably primarily interested in muscle growth. And so it's a method that somehow fell out of favor, but I think is really, really helpful. And I actually think it has some advantages over many other alternatives that have become more popular. And then another method that I do like is one that has been revisited in recent times because of a couple of studies that have come out. A lot of people have been speaking about stretching at the end of repetitions or in between sets, for instance. And obviously some of the early work done on this was looking at the calves by Varnecke and the other people that he works with. But many people in the athletic training world have been using loaded stretching for decades for various reasons. And I worked as a sprints coach from 2009 to 2014. And I used it a lot with my athletes back then for several reasons. One of them was as a positional teaching tool. So if you've got someone who's not lifted weights before, they're fast naturally. They come into the gym because they will benefit and they will get faster still as a product of getting stronger. But they've not squatted before and they've got some mobility restrictions. I would have them do things like holding the bottom position of a dumbbell goblet squat to teach them how to get into that position. And it's not only helpful when it comes to teaching that position, it's also helpful when it comes to actually developing range of motion in those joints, in part because of some of the architectural adaptations that you get in skeletal muscle. You get sarcomerogenesis and an increase in muscle fascicle length. And so it's good for flexibility. The recent research shows that it can support muscle hypertrophy too. And one of the other real advantages is that if you look at the research on isometric training, then at shorter muscle lengths, getting stronger in a particular position only transfers to a relatively small range of different joint positions. Something like 10 to 15 degrees on either side of the joint position. So if you're holding the 3/4 position up out of a squat, then you'd get stronger at the top of the squat, but you wouldn't get much stronger in the whole. That's not true of training at long muscle lengths. If you train at long muscle lengths and hold those positions, you get stronger throughout the range of motion. So the transfer to different ranges is much greater, but the total joint stress is quite low, in particular when it comes to something like a squat where you're quite weak in that deep position. And so just adding some loaded stretches to either the end of an individual exercise or the end of a total training session, in particular, if you've got mobility restrictions, I think is a really easy win too.
That immediately makes me think of my calf mobility since doing lengthened partials exclusively for my calves because of the work that came out and just essentially showing that, hey, we seem to grow much better by just working this lengthened range. And maybe it's a bit more complementary to where our calf is strongest as well. And yeah, the mobility gains I get from that, even acutely before, if I do it before like a leg press or a squat pattern, but also now just I've got much more mobility through that joint. And I think a lot of the listeners come from a background, if not continue to train like full ROM and getting into those deep positions. But I think also, like a lot of the listeners, me at least, when I first started squatting, my depth was not great. But over time, as you kind of build into it, you kind of gain that range of motion. So it almost is like these loaded stretches. But I do really like, particularly on squat patterns and for a teaching, to kind of pause in those positions as well at various times to help teach technique to get comfortable in that bottom position. And almost, I think over time, they do gain range of motion there too. So I've definitely seen that myself. And then on your first point, it sounds very much like a lot of, I guess, intensifiers, advanced training techniques, people like to call them, where you kind of use short rest periods to stay under fatigue to continue to get, like you said, effective reps. People would be very aware of, and I'm sure you are, Greg, of Myo Reps by Borge Fagelli. I pronounce his name terribly, but it sounds like a great way, especially for those who are time limited, to use that model and to just work on getting more dense training in.
Yeah, and the reason that I like both of them is because of their time efficiency. And when I'm speaking about using the loaded stretching there, I'm talking about potentially using that as a standalone. So for an exercise, just holding those static positions in the lengthened position for probably anywhere between 30 and 60 seconds or so. And obviously you can combine these different methods too. Like you can use isometrics during escalating density training. It's possible to do that. But going back to loaded stretching, using that, you can get some muscle hypertrophy, some strength gains throughout the range of motion. You can use substantially lower training loads, which is good for your joint longevity. And you can get better in your technique doing those exercises, and then use them as a stepping stone to higher load versions of the lift. So taking the example of squatting, if you've got a newbie, they could do that with dumbbell goblet squat, and they could go from that into a paused dumbbells goblet squat, and they could go from that into a regular dynamic one, and then from that into a front squat, and then from that into a back squat, for instance. And so it's a nice way of creating a sequence that seamlessly has somebody improve their flexibility, their strength, and their muscle mass through a single type of time efficient exercise while sparing their joints too. I'm not saying it's for everyone, but I just think that people think a bit narrowly in how they apply that particular method. And recently people have tended to focus on length and partials and maybe doing some loaded stretching between sets or whatever. But there are other ways that you can use these methods too.
Yeah, I think it was Footsie 7. It was like a big part of it was like loaded stretching. FST, yeah. Why have I said footsie? Like the footsie 100. I think also dog crap training by Dante Trudell. He had some like loaded stretching in there.
Rises. Yeah.
Yeah. Scott Stevenson, I think he has some in his programming as well, within fortitude training. It's never actually something I've done apart from like I talked about how I've integrated it. So it sounds, from what I understand, it can be quite painful in terms of like just as you sink into that and hold it.
Yeah, but in part because of that, you get some nice other adaptations too. You get some nice metabolic and vascular adaptations as well. So yeah, it's a really good option for many people across the board, but in particular when introducing new exercises.
Do you have any others for training? Because I have a few questions that have just popped into my head that I could ask, or if you have any more, then you might already cover them.
No, I don't. Go for it.
So yeah, one that a couple come to, well, I guess some people are afraid of like heavy loads, and they're like, oh, squatting heavy, deadlifting heavy, whatever it is, axial loading, it beat me up. It kind of, the body's fragile and it's caused me injuries in future. They might point to like a Ronnie Coleman and be like, hey, look at Ronnie versus a Jay Cutler who maybe trained, or Jay Cutler. Did I just mix two people up?
No, Jay Cutler. Yeah.
Jay Cutler. I was like, it's because I have someone else in my head. Why have I forgotten his name? Phil Heath. There you go. Phil Heath also didn't train that heavy. He kind of trained a bit lighter, and they're relatively injury free now. And obviously, there's so many confounders there. But do you think kind of load on the bar, frequency of kind of axial loading, machines versus free weights, is there anything to that?
Yeah, I think there is in terms of the adaptations that you get, for sure. So if you think about this in terms of the skeletal system rather than the muscular system, then your bones respond in particular to certain things, like the magnitude and the rate of the loading. And so if you're thinking about your vertebrae, then that type of axial loading is creating a large compressive force through those joints. And so it's stimulating remodeling of the connective tissues between those bones, but also the bones themselves, and increasing bone mineral density, which is important, especially as we get older, because it tends to dwindle, and then ultimately that exposes us to fractures. And then when we fracture something late in life, like a hip, we end up in bed, and then we're in this vicious cycle of frailty where disuse drives disuse atrophy, increasing frailty, and then ultimately our lives end earlier than we would like. So that type of increased bone mineral density does really matter for health. But obviously you want to get that in a way that is likely to minimize injury risk too. And so there are trade-offs that we make when it comes to exercise selection. And those will vary between people, and also how injurious a given exercise is likely to be will interact with somebody's morphometry, with the size of their joints and so on. And so some people are much better suited to some exercises than others. But based on all of that, I tend to be relatively conservative when it comes to exercise selection. Just as an example of this, there's this, and Steve, I don't want to step on your toes here because I know that you've gone through this evolution with how you do rows, but there's been this transition in recent times from people rowing maybe with the lumbar spine in a neutral position to being an increasingly flex position. And I understand the rationale. People are trying to increase the stretch on the muscles that are being trained. But from my perspective, thinking about longevity, I would much rather have people rely pretty much exclusively on chest supported rowing exercises. There are loads that you can do using pulleys from a cable column. And then there are loads of great machine exercises too now, like different chest supported T-bar rows and hammer rows, and the list goes on and on. That way, you're still nailing the muscles that you want to nail, in particular the shoulder extensors in this instance, so the lats and so on. But you're giving the lumbar spine a break, and then otherwise the erectors are going to be trained relatively intensively during exercises where they're challenged more or less isometrically, like different squatting motions, and maybe you're doing some Romanian deadlifts, whatever you want to call them, for your hamstrings primarily. So that's my particular bias, just because some people will be able to do those exercises, like bent over rows with a flex spine, for years and get away with it. Other people, they won't last very long at all. So I tend to cater for the lowest common denominator and default to doing rowing exercises in chest supported position. And then when it comes to training the erectors, train them statically, because you can still develop massive spinal erectors doing different deadlifting exercises and squatting exercises and so on.
Interesting. Yeah, I think that's a kind of spinal flexion. It's a debated topic, I think.
It is, yeah. And in one camp, you've got someone like Stu McGill, who's incredibly anti it. And I spoke with him for my own podcast. We had a long chat, which was great. And I love Stu. He's a really nice guy, but he's also open-minded and humble for someone with his experience and his expertise. But he's very much of the camp where you shouldn't be loading your spine excessively, in particular in the gym, in flex positions or near end range of motion, with lots of rotation, with lots of lateral flexion. And then other people, they'll say, well, you need some of that in order to maintain your resilience. But also, I think there's a really big psychological component where if people are fearful of those types of spinal motions, they're more likely to have pain in response to them. So there's definitely a balance. I just think that for someone like a bodybuilder who doesn't have to do the lateral flexion, the rotation, and the spinal flexion to get the results they're after, don't bother. Like, why risk it? If there's no extra gain to be had, you might then say, well, I think that including some flex position spinal extension exercises could be good for your spinal erectors. What does that mean? You're going to start doing rounded back good mornings and rounded back deadlifts in order to build those erectors? Probably not. So you're going to do some rounded back rows in order to support those erectors. You could do, but is that going to have a benefit above and beyond what you would get from Romanian deadlifts and squats and so on when you're already getting substantial loading in those positions. I don't know.
Are you familiar with the Jefferson curl? I believe I've named that right.
Yeah,
Where
like
it
standing
is literally,
and it was
yeah,
borrowed from gymnastics. There's a guy, Christopher Sommer, who had a program called, going way back in my memory now, but he had a very popular website called Gymnastics Bodies or Gymnastic Bodies, really 25 years ago, 20 years ago. And then that got picked up by people like Tim Ferriss, and then that got popularized, and then people started using Jefferson curls. I was a massive exercise science nerd. If you if you haven't noticed, back in the day, now my interests are much more varied. But yeah, that came out of Christopher Sommer's approach to training people, and he had great results with it. And so that's an interesting example where you're training the spine in a very flex position. But if I recall correctly, Christopher never had people use very large loads with their exercise. And so for something like that, I think you're more likely to be able to get away with it if you're using quite modest loads during it. And then when you're loading the spine more heavily, defaulting to trying to maintain a neutral position of the lumbar spine might make sense.
yeah, it's become. I've just seen it. It's starting to enter into the bodybuilding circles again. It's
Right.
interesting to see that come in, and yeah, I think something that was very pertinent that you mentioned is how some people can quote unquote get away with it, and I definitely have seen that in my coaching experience where some people they deal with it just fine and actually seems to potentially even build resilience. I kind of find that for me, I find it almost helps me in those more axial loaded movements like an RDL when I introduce a small amount of bent over rowing with it versus not. Whereas for other people, it's like their axial loading has to be so limited because otherwise their lower back just starts to become the limiting factor in almost too many things.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. And just to take another extreme example, think about yogis and the positions that they put their spines in. A lot of people listening to this, in particular, guys who are quite heavy, who've got quite thick spines, if they tried to do that, they'd probably just herniate a disc within the first seconds.
Yeah, I don't think it's going to work well for them. The other thought I had was I don't know if there's anything to like blood flow restriction training. When I think about advanced training techniques, and obviously a lot of them are very metabolic in terms of what they're building up, the metabolites and everything, but nothing is like BFR. And I would imagine you'd be in favor using BFR as like a strategy to work muscles whilst mitigating the load needed that might put onto joint and connective tissue. So it could be used kind of reactively. But do you ever think that should be like a proactive tool that anyone should think about, or is there any benefits to like getting such a huge amount of like blood and metabolite build up within the muscles?
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, my master's degree, this is like 2013, 2014, I looked at combining ischemic preconditioning with blood flow restriction exercise to look at whether the IPC would increase the responses to the subsequent low load blood flow restriction training. So I was very interested in the subject between about 2009 and 2015. I haven't kept up to date with the literature because I feel like my views on it are already quite established in terms of how I would use it with people. I have a reservation, which is just that a lot of people take this DIY approach. And I know that there's been some research looking at the safety of having people cuff themselves. You take wraps and you have them wrap their own limbs to a subjective level of tightness, and then you look at whether there are any adverse events during a training program. And that research suggests that for the most part, it's relatively safe. That's fine, but I just think that there are always going to be some people that take it too far. And having at-home devices that will give people a bit more control over some of the restriction parameters, but having people with a bit more control over some of the cuff parameters is probably a good thing. So it's not something that I would advocate for en masse and say people should be doing this at home to save their joints as an alternative to higher low training. But like you say, it can be beneficial. And once again, it's time efficient because if you compare it to unrestricted training done at the same relative intensities, proportions of 1 rep max, then people can't do as many reps, and a greater proportion of the reps that they do are going to be effective because they recruit the highest threshold motor units earlier within a set. And people get similar hypertrophy to doing higher load conventional resistance training. They won't get all the same adaptations. They won't, for instance, necessarily get some of the same bone adaptations, bearing in mind what I said earlier about Wolff's law and how bones remodel in response to the magnitude and the rate of loading. But they can get impressive muscle hypertrophy. They can get good strength gains that, again, won't be as good as high load conventional training. But if people could do this at home in a safe way, knowing the parameters, pressure, the cuff widths, and so on, then I think it would be great for a lot of people to use prophylactically. And they wouldn't necessarily use it exclusively. They'd probably use it as an adjunct to their regular training. And so maybe they've got some higher load conventional training, in part because of its bone building stimulus. But then to spare their joints, they're including some of this type of low load training, and then they're getting some really nice muscular and vascular and metabolic adaptations in response to it. And people have increasingly looked at different applications of it. So initially, a lot of it just had people use loads of 20 to 50% of 1 rep max and do several sets to fatigue. Whereas now people are looking at combining it with cyclical endurance type exercise. When I was at Loughborough, one of the PhD students was looking at using it during high intensity intermittent training in elite cyclists. And they found some substantial gains in some performance parameters within quite a short period of time. So you can use it to provide a really potent stimulus. And there are lots of unconventional ways of including it in your training that haven't been so well studied that could be advantageous. So in principle, I really like it. It's just not something that I'd be comfortable saying, you should be doing this at home. I think maybe in 10 years' time, when some of these medical grade devices are available to more people, if that's the case, then at that point, many of us might be starting to use them in order to keep our joints healthy, but maintain our fat-free mass and our muscle function too.
Yeah, I think that's very well said. I know I've had clients who've they've had injuries and we've wanted to introduce BFR and they've been concerned about the potential implications for it, like you said, of doing it and performing it, because it does kind of feel wrong and it feels very different to anything else that you've done in the gym. And so, like you said, the research tends to favor that there isn't like bad outcomes that come from using it, and people who are otherwise healthy should be fine. But yeah, with the type of things that people are purchasing, normally it's either, and I've done it myself, where I've just used like knee sleeves to like wrap around my upper thigh, and I think you can get ones that are like they measure, so you can like pull it to a 7, and so you can have some consistency there potentially. But the best I've used, and actually they sponsored a couple of podcasts for us called Saga Fitness, and they have an app, and then it is like a cuff that blows up to a certain pressure, and so it's a bit more standardized that way. But I will say, I wouldn't choose to use them because I do find them to be a bit just awkward. It's another thing to have in the kit bag. It's another thing to have to use. But now and then for some spice or for mitigating or working around some kind of joint and connective tissue things, using loads that are 20% of your 1 rep max, and they will quickly humble you when you're occluded.
Yeah.
Nice
and
one.
I too have done the at-home training. This is years and years ago. This is probably 16 years ago. But I'm always the idiot. So I'd be that person with the knee sleeves who's including both venous return, but also arterial flow. And then quickly my legs turning some strange shade of blue. And I'm thinking, was that right? I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think the subjective nature of it as well, it's like a 7 out of 10 tightness, but some people are just masochists, so they're just going to take it too far. And then other people, they'll be like, oh, I'm not doing anything because they're worried that it's not going to be tight enough. So it is a little bit tricky as a tool, but a useful one when you can get it right. So we've done nutrition, training, lifestyle.
Yeah, so I think there are some simple environmental changes that people can make. One of them would be ventilating your home. sounds so obvious as to be pointless, but keeping your windows open, opening them intermittently, because there are various different things that build up in the environment when you don't do that that are not good for your health. And there's been a lot of research into sick building syndrome in the last couple of decades, especially. And when you're spending so much time indoors, that kind of thing really does matter. So simply swapping out the air in your home periodically by opening the windows, and I know a lot of us do this in the summer and the warmer months, but maybe do it less so in the winter, can make a meaningful difference to your health over time, in particular if you're exposed to some nasty things in your environment. So think about things like molds and so on. And then otherwise, if you can sit by the window or work by the window, then that's going to be a good thing for you in terms of your cognition, in terms of your biological rhythms, in terms of your sleep. Just because the intensity of the light that you're exposed to drops exponentially the further that you move from the window. And that intensity is key because the discrepancy between the intensity of light that you're exposed to indoors, even in a well-lit room, and outdoors on a sunny day in the middle of the day is enormous. As I've mentioned before, it might be that the intensity of light is 500 lux indoors in a room. It's probably about what I'm exposed to at the moment, maybe even slightly less than that. Whereas if I go outside here at 11 a.m., right now it's probably 90,000 lux. So way, way, way higher. And it's not obvious to us in terms of how we see the world, but our body's clockwork and a certain type of specialized photoreceptor in the eye do register that. And in turn, the higher light intensity will support various different dimensions of cognition, most notably alertness, but some others too. Can support mood. This is part of the reason why some of us get seasonal affective disorder. It's to do with differences in the total amount of photons that we're exposed to during the winter versus other times of year. This, at the level of the eye, that is. And then sleep, in part because it's helping to anchor the timing of our body's clockwork, but also because it's buffering us against any small negative effects of exposure to light at night on our clocks and our sleep. So it's really the contrast between the intensity of light that we get during the day and the total amount of it and what we get at night that matters. So just sitting by the window or standing by the window is a really easy win. And then thinking about your workspace, I think sit-to-stand desks are great. Not necessarily just stand desks or treadmill desks, but the ability to move between different positions seems to be particularly beneficial, especially when it comes to certain musculoskeletal issues like lower back pain. And so many people who train hard experience that. I think that that's something that they should certainly consider if it's feasible for them, if, for instance, they work from home. And then just other things like having houseplants, like having plants near your computer, in terms of the quality of the air that you're exposed to, because they do help filter some nasties from the environment. But also just looking at nature tends to promote relaxation. You see that both in terms of people's subjective feelings, but also in terms of physiological proxies of relaxation, whether that's salivary cortisol or pulse rate variability. So having a couple of houseplants around is bound to be a good thing. And I think when it comes to the immediate environment, those are some really easy wins.
Makes a lot of sense. Yeah, it's. I remember. I think we might have spoken about house plants before, and I have a couple on my left here by my window, and they're not doing too hot actually. One of them's kind of passed away, so they probably need to be alive house plants. You need to take care of them a bit more. So, but some easy wins there that you mentioned, like you said, just making sure to keep your window, like opening a window in the morning, kind of letting some airflow through. I'm trying to think of like habit stacking so that I can make sure that in my head, at least, if I build it into my day, it's more likely to happen. And then, I mean, house plants, having those around, no bad idea. And yeah, standing desks, they're so available now. It's kind of a bit of a no-brainer, but I can't say that I stand too often at this desk, but at least I break up my day a lot with walks due to commuting to the gym, walking the dog, I kind of get it through that. But for those that don't, like a standing desk is a no-brainer. Or if you work off a laptop, you can take it to a kitchen and kind of work off there. So yeah, some easy little things people can be doing already to improve their health.
Yeah. And then one more that I'll add in case you want to move on to the next section, because I realise we've been speaking for nearly an hour already. This is one of several subjects that we're supposed to touch today, is giving blood, which I've mentioned on this podcast before. I also did a solo episode on my own podcast, shameless plug, about the health benefits of giving blood, which I think are most germane to men. There are lots of reasons for that, and there are many good cases in which people should give blood, strong rationales to give blood. But just to highlight a few, part of the reason why there's a disparity between rates of cardiovascular disease between men and women, with women having lower rates in the first half of life, is because during the reproductive years, women lose blood on a regular basis if they're cycling. And that helps offload iron from the body, and excessive iron can contribute to excessive oxidative stress, which in turn has all sorts of negative downstream consequences. When people give blood, they tend to acutely experience a bunch of different beneficial effects. So one of them is that there's a quick drop in blood pressure, tends to be a small improvement in blood sugar control too. And one of the reasons why I think this is very interesting is that it does actually help offload some nasty chemicals from your body, some so-called forever chemicals. So PFASs, which people will have come across. There's been some good documentaries about the subject in recent times, and some people are pushing to try and ban them entirely in some parts of the world, which would be incredibly hard to enforce because they're so ubiquitous. But the reason they're called forever chemicals is just that our bodies don't have good ways of detoxifying them. So they tend to accumulate in our bodies over time. And one of the ways that we can get rid of them is through sweat. But maybe one of the best ways we can get rid of them is by giving blood. And there's been some nice research on firefighters who give plasma on a regular basis. The nice thing about donating plasma is that you can do so more frequently than giving whole blood. And when they frequently donate plasma, they offload large amounts of these forever chemicals, which is really important to firefighters because they get exposed to very high quantities of them through the work that they do. I also suspect that it's going to help offload a bunch of other nasties. So some heavy metals, I think probably microplastics and nanoplastics too. So while the idea of bloodletting is one that's been around in medical realms for millennia and has fallen in and out of favor because some of the initial ideas were so wrong-headed, done in a smart way, it can be really beneficial. And we see that in the epidemiology too. For instance, people who give blood on a regular basis have lower rates of all-cause mortality and lower rates of cardiovascular disease. And there are confounders there. There's the healthy user bias, healthy user effect, where it's likely that people who are giving blood on a regular basis are otherwise healthier than their counterparts who don't give blood on a regular basis. And it's hard to statistically control for all the different things that might differ between those individuals. However, the signal is quite consistent. And I think that the signal is actually a real one. It's just that we don't necessarily know the magnitude of it right now. And again, this isn't for everyone. If you've got iron deficiency anemia, then it's not for you. If you're an endurance athlete and you're trying to push up your VO2 max or VO2 peak as quickly as possible, then giving blood is going to tank your exercise performance temporarily in endurance exercise. You won't notice it really in terms of your resistance training. You might just be a bit more winded on lower body training days. But in terms of health, it's great. And the final thing that I'll say is the most important one, and that's that you might save someone else's life. So I think there's a psychological component to it as well, where you feel good about yourself, and then that probably has some knock-on positive effects on your own health. So I really see it as part of a virtuous cycle and a win-win, especially for people like you and I, Steve, like guys of our age. And I know that a large proportion of people listening to this probably fall into that demographic.
Yeah. Yeah, well said. It's really, I know we have spoken about it before. It's one of those things that it's nothing I do, and it's nothing that sounds enjoyable, but should probably try and instigate it. Kind of like brushing your teeth. Like, I don't love brushing my teeth, but I do it twice a day, every day, and I've done it for years, and I won't miss it because I know it's how important that is. Obviously, I think there's a bit of a larger barrier to entry because you have to go somewhere. There might be some discomfort involved and what have you. But I definitely think it's something I want to take more seriously and actually try and set up into a semi-regular kind of consistent pattern. Do you have a general recommendation in terms of frequency of giving blood for this specific reason? And then you mentioned there's not really any large negative impacts on resistance training, so I guess periodizing it with your resistance training isn't something you have to worry about too much, but maybe not when you're at like peak volumes and intensities.
Yeah, I think that's a reasonable recommendation, in part because while I've not ever looked for this literature, to my knowledge, it hasn't been well demonstrated that giving blood disposes you to infections or whatever. However, I suspect that there is a short-term drop in immune function. And so if you're pushing your training loads, your volumes and intensities very high, let's say you're in an overreaching phase, that's not the right time to be giving blood. And I know that experientially, I've had a cold after giving blood probably 4 or 5 times at a frequency higher than I would expect just by probability alone. And I think that's because of some short term drop in immune function. If you give blood, you're losing some immune cells. It makes sense that there might be some reduction in some of those functions. So I think coinciding it with phases of your training and phases of your life where your stresses aren't too high and you're relatively well rested would make a lot of sense. And then in terms of frequency, I think it's self-limiting. You can only give whole blood at a certain interval in countries like the UK. And each time you go, there's a proxy of your iron status that is tested. And if you're below a certain threshold, then you're not allowed to donate. And so in that way, it's self-limiting. Yeah, well, I give blood when I can. My problem is that
Okay.
I'm so itinerant and I travel so much. There are many countries where when you go there, you can't give blood for several months after. And for instance, I've given blood twice in the last year, which is less regular than if I was just in the UK. If I was just in the UK, I'd probably donate 4 times a year. And I have done sometimes previously, but I spent most of the last year in Asia and Central America. And so because of that, I can't give that often. But I think as a general recommendation for people listening, a couple of times a year would be great because you're probably going to get some health benefits from that. You're not taxing your resilience too much and you're meaningfully helping out too.
And I imagine the average person doesn't. So, like, even once a year is already like a huge step up for a lot of people. So it's
Once in a
like,
lifetime is better than never,
yeah,
provided that it
exactly.
goes well. But the frequency of things going wrong is very, very low. I've never had any issues and I've given about 30 times now in the space of about 17 years. So it's rare that anything does go wrong.
Absolutely. So, like you said, that was the kind of first chunky topic covered. I don't know if we have, maybe we probably do have time for this next one, where you kind of actually already alluded to it with giving blood and therefore getting rid of some of these toxins, of which one of them that I think is very much in vogue right now, it's certainly something I've seen more and more talked about, is this discussion of microplastics, their impact on health. And I know off air I kind of nudged you on it and I was like, how bad are these for us? Are like people just like spiraling out of control, and they're kind of just fear mongering the general public? And you seem to be like, actually there probably are some concerns here. So I thought it was worth getting you on to kind of dig into it a little bit and give the listeners the lowdown on microplastics on health.
Yeah. Well, we can try and rattle through the remaining sections rather than getting hung up on some of the interesting nuances. But yeah, I do think that they are a problem. And it's often the case that initially the pendulum swings too far in a certain direction and the risks are over exaggerated. And I haven't spent enough time following the online conversation to know if that's the case, but clearly they are problematic. And for the foreseeable future, I think they're likely to become more burdensome in terms of our health. And there are lots of reasons for that. One of them is just that they're already pretty ubiquitous. We already knew that they were in the environment in the 1960s. And we know that they're more or less everywhere now. There have been surveys finding them up Everest, finding them in ice caps in the middle of the ocean. So just to break down the sizes of plastics, we got three different sizes that are often spoken about. The smallest are the nanoplastics, and these have sizes between 1 nanometer and 1 micrometer. The next size up is microplastics. So those are between 1 micrometer, 5 millimeters. And then we have macroplastics, which are larger than that. And obviously, as the plastics in the environment get broken down, they get broken down into smaller and smaller fragments. Part of the problem with that is that they actually accumulate in different organisms more readily when they're smaller. And they're actually more toxic per mass, because if you just think about a given mass of plastic, the more pieces that it's split into, the greater the surface area. And so the greater the chemical exposure that you have to it. And we could think of them simplistically as having two different types of toxicity, one related to the actual physical presence of them obstructing things, and the other being chemical toxicity, which is strongly related to that surface area. So they're everywhere, and the concentrations of them in various different organisms are increasing over time. That's true of us too. And just to give a couple of examples of this, there was a study recently looking at the brains of people who'd passed away recently. And they looked at different cohorts of people, and people who'd passed away closer to the present moment had higher brain plastic concentrations than people who'd passed away a few years previously. There have also been studies of people undergoing certain types of surgery finding the presence of plastics in various different parts of their body. And we know that there are these micro nanoplastics in practically all tissues that have been studied so far, as well as body fluids. They're in the brain, they're in the liver, they're in the lungs, they're in the kidneys, they're in the urine, they're in the sperm, they're in the placenta, they're everywhere. So that's not good news. How do they relate to health outcomes? Well, going back to the study that looked at people and looked at their brains, that particular study found that, particularly concerningly, the concentration in the brain was a lot higher than it was in some other organs. So the concentration in the brains, I think, were 7 to 30 times higher than in the liver or the kidney. And part of the reason for that is just because if you think about tissues like the liver, a lot of the plastic that the liver is exposed to is probably coming from nutrition, from the foods that we consume and the drinks that we consume. In the case of the brain, though, we breathe in a lot of plastic. A lot of it gets liberated from things like tires as cars charge around the roads. And so we're probably inhaling a lot, and then that's getting into the brain via the olfactory system too. So concentration in the brain are very high. And then that particular research found that if you compared people who passed away with dementia to their non-demented peers, the people with dementia had 2 to 10 times higher brain plastic concentrations. It's not clear whether that's a function of exposure to the plastic or if that reflects the fact that their brains are less able to detoxify the plastic. Just as an example of this, when you sleep, your brain's immune system, part of your brain's immune system, the lymphatic system, goes to work and clears out various debris that have accumulated during metabolic activity associated with wakefulness. And that tends to go awry in various different neurodegenerative conditions, in part because of a loss of slow wave activity during sleep. And so it could be that their brains plastic concentrations are higher just because the brain immune system isn't working so well. But regardless, that's a big discrepancy between those two groups of people. And similarly, there was a study, high profile study, looking at people undergoing surgery of the carotid artery, which is the artery that supplies your brain with freshly oxygenated blood. And it looked at two different types of plastic, and the most abundant plastic that is used was present in over 50% of people. And then 12% of patients had the other type of plastic that they looked at. And concerningly, when they then followed up these people over time, the people with plastic in the plaques in these arteries were at a much greater risk of going on to die, whether from all causes combined or whether from cardiovascular disease specifically. So they had a 4.5-fold greater risk of passing away in years to come. So clearly that type of plastic is associating with subsequent dysfunction. And then we also have some of these surveys looking at concentrations of plastics in compartments like the urine, and people who pee out more plastic, suggesting they have higher plastic intakes, are more likely to experience certain abnormalities like reproductive dysfunction. So the epidemiology is signaling that there is an association between plastic consumption and negative health consequences. And then we have some preclinical research looking at non-human animals, trying to understand some of the mechanisms that might be at play, but it's really hard to make sense of those data for several reasons. One is just that you can't really model the diversity of different types of plastics that we get exposed to in the real world and the routes of exposure and so on. Another is obviously organismal differences between different animals. And so I think we've got to take that research with a pinch of Himalayan sea salt or Himalayan mountain salt, whatever it might be. See what I did there? And just keep that in mind, not overinterpret it. But clearly it shows problems related to both the chemical exposure and that type of obstruction in different biological passages that I mentioned earlier. Just as an example of this, I think there's been some work looking at animals so rodents that are exposed to plastic, finding they're more likely to go on to develop neurodegeneration. And that seems to be because some of the immune cells in the brain are consuming this plastic, and then because they can't properly break it down, some of those cells are basically serving as blockades within the brain, which is obstructing blood flow and other types of flow too, and then driving dysfunction. So based on all of that, I think there are lots of causes for concern, but the question that follows is, what can we do about it? And happily, I think there are lots of things that we can do about it. And it's also likely that many people listening to this are already doing several things that can help them rid themselves of plastic. But I'll just pause there, Steve, and ask if there's anything you want to jump in on.
No, I think that's very well explained. And the more I've at least thought about plastics and in the environment and what I do day to day with plastics and without plastics and that sort of thing, just the more I've realized they're inescapable to a large extent, unless you go live in a forest in the woods. And I don't know, even the animals then that you hunt and prey on are going to have some plastics in them, what have you. So it's kind of one of those inescapable things. And I worry for those health hypochondriacs out there for this subject, because I think it could, the stress of thinking about microplastics and plastics in the environment probably going to start offsetting. I mean, the stress is going to start offsetting the degree of detriment that they may be having. And we, like you said, basically don't know. Certainly looks to be correlated, and maybe even more than just correlated, with poor health outcomes. So I think talking about some of the things that we can do or are already doing that's great for getting rid of some of these microplastics would be great.
I fully agree with that. And just to give an interesting example, if you look at the research on tea consumption is generally associated with positive health outcomes. However, tea bags not all tea bags, but most tea bags contain huge quantities of tiny fragments of plastic. And so clearly, the good things about tea and the actual leaves themselves seem to be, in many ways, outweighing the negative effects of the tea bag plastic. So we need to bear that kind of thing in mind. And I just say that to try and put some people's minds at ease, because there will be people who are terrified of plastic now and it causes them real stress. But hopefully, if that is the case, then it just nudges them to make some simple lifestyle changes. And then when you've made those, you've just got to focus on the controllables. And there are lots of things that you can't control. And you shouldn't worry about those excessively, because that's ultimately just going to be bad for you. But in terms of reducing your plastic consumption, there are lots of things you could do. So with respect to your nutrition, one example of this is stop chewing gum. So
I saw that recent paper.
Well, it's been known for a while.
Really?
Oh yeah. I remember seeing some bloke on Dragon's Den a few years ago pushing his plastic-free chewing gum to the
Oh,
dragons, trying to get them to invest in it. But the ingredient on the label, gum base, is often plastic. So if you are an avid gum consumer, which I think many people probably are, in particular during contest prep, stop that. Or if there are any good plastic-free chewing gums out there now, and I think there are. I remember going to a food expo about 8 years ago, and there were already some chewing gum businesses that were on the case back then. So you can track down one of these plastic-free chewing gums if that's so. Otherwise, some foods have higher quantities of plastic in them than others. Bear in mind what I said about plastic in the environment being readily distributed. Just think about plastic ending up in the ocean, and then some of the water there being evaporated into the air, and then wind pushing that, and then it rains in the mountains and it falls in the mountains and so on. You can readily understand how they are in so many different types of foods now. Of the foods that have been tested so far, though, some are much richer in plastics than others. So sea salt is one of those, actually. It's quite high in plastic for the most part, perhaps unsurprisingly. Otherwise, in terms of foods, bivalves, so things like oysters and mussels, tend to be quite high in plastic. Fish that you consume whole, so if you think about eating sardines, they tend to be quite high in plastic too, in part because the plastic's moving through the digestive system. Whereas if you think about eating salmon, where it's filleted, your plastic consumption from those could be lower. But obviously there's also an interaction with where an animal sits in the food chain, etc. And I'm not saying stop eating sardines because small oily fish are so good for you. But if you had a choice between eating mussels and eating salmon, in terms of plastic exposure, I would think that you're probably better off eating the salmon. There are some
Greg,
plants too. Yeah.
just on the sardines, you can buy sardines that have been gutted.
Oh, is that right?
So yeah, it's funny because I heard this get talked about. I think it was on, it might have been on Modern Wisdom with Chris Williamson, where he interviewed someone on the topic, and she brought up sardines, and I just thought of consuming more sardines because of the omega-3s, and they're cheaper than having salmon. And then I bought two. The more expensive one was gutted, whereas the cheap one was like the whole fish, and it was way cheaper, but it's still cheaper than salmon getting the one that's gutted. So for those that like their sardines, you can get them gutted.
Nice. I didn't know that. So then in terms of other foods, plants, rice can be quite high in plastics. Some fruits and vegetables tend to be higher than others. So I believe the concentrations in apples and some other fruits, and then with respect to vegetables, I think concentrations in carrots are quite high. But it's quite hard to say how foods rank, because I'm sure that it's dependent on where the foods are grown, and it hasn't been that systematically reviewed. So once again, I would take some of that literature with a pinch of salt and not worry about it too much. And I think, frankly, that that's probably not something to focus on for most people when there are other things that could be lower hanging fruit. Increasing fiber intake could be helpful, because insoluble fiber basically can form a gel around different plastics that then helps remove them. And then, sorry, that's true of soluble fiber. And then insoluble fiber can just help push things through your digestive tract. So if you're on a high fiber diet, which you probably are already, then that's great. It's probably not great for the carnivore diet consumers that are out there. And then in terms of your water consumption, you might want to filter your water, but different types of filtration methods probably differ substantially. And if you've got access to a reverse osmosis water filtration system, then that's probably one of the better options that are out there. I haven't actually looked properly at how a lot of the more common water filters stack up. For instance, back in the UK, I just use a Brita water filter, and I don't actually know what type of filtration mechanism they use, so I really should check that. And I suspect that it's probably something that contains plastic, and obviously water passes through a plastic cartridge. So yeah, when it comes to filtration, that is a variable. And I know there's been some work looking at, for instance, ceramic mechanisms of filtration, finding those to be better than ones that are based on plastic. And then when it comes to food and drink packaging, I think that that is a really important consideration. And how long food is in its packaging, the temperatures that it reaches while in there, exposure to light and oxygen, all of those can affect the breakdown of the plastic into food. And so you want to minimize the amount of time at high temperatures that food gets exposed to plastic, obviously, if possible, buy food that's not wrapped in plastic. But a lot of this, I think, is most relevant to the water that we drink. There are still lots of people that drink from plastic water bottles. And I see this in the sauna the whole time, which drives me nuts. And occasionally I say something, and I never want to be that weird, awkward person saying anything. But I just know if you're taking a plastic water bottle into a 90 degrees Celsius sauna, then a lot of plastic is being leached there. So please, please don't do that. And this is also very relevant to things like kettles. A lot of people have plastic kettles. And then when those are heated, you're going to get some degradation. There are some coffee makers. So ironically, the place where I am at the moment, it's got a plastic drip coffee machine. And I've been using that because that's my one option at the moment. But each time I use it, I think, this plastic tastes so good. So
It's like me. I have an espresso, and every day I'm using it. I'm like, oh, once I've worked through all my pods, what am I going to do? Am I going to go to something else?
well, that's it, because the pods are another source, right? So different types of preparing coffee would probably be preferable. Take, for instance, using Chemex, which is a glass-based filtration system, or using a French press. That's probably going to be better than passing water through one of these plastic-based devices. If you're using something like a V60, then you can pick a glass or ceramic V60 as opposed to a plastic one. So sometimes there are some simple substitutions that you can make, which are barely different financially as well. And then there are still some canned products that are lined with a particular type of plastic called BPA, bisphenol A. Something to note is when it comes to products on the market, many are marketed as being BPA free, but that doesn't mean they're plastic free. It just means they're BPA free. So BPA free, in my mind, doesn't really mean that much. When it comes to eating on the go, sometimes you might use Tupperware, and don't use plastic Tupperware if at all possible. Go for like Pyrex dishes instead. And same goes for different types of cutlery, like some of these plastic knives and forks. Maybe you go out for barbecue at the start of the summer and you're eating with plastic knives and forks and maybe plastic plates as well. That's another situation in which you're going to get exposed to some of this. And then with food that's been cooked and then gets left in the fridge, a lot of people will wrap it in cling film. And that is going to break down over time, especially if the food is still warm when you put the cling film on it. Please don't do that. I remember being at someone's house not long ago, and someone in the house was being really sweet, and she made a stew for everyone in the house, and under the stew was cling film. So while this stew had been in the pressure cooker, it had just been sat on cling film the entire time. And I thought, I've got to eat this. And I'm not going to say anything because I don't want to be that guy.
Yeah.
It is unfortunate. And I hate to think how high my plastic consumption has been at times. So that's another simple change to make if you do regularly use cling film. And then moving on from foods, plastic is still used quite a lot in the cosmetic industry. So there are still some products that are out there, like fragrances and whatnot, that contain some plastics in there. There are specific things that you might see on a label that would indicate the presence of plastics. My understanding is that a lot of the products that used to contain these little micro beads of plastic. I remember having a face wash when I was a teenager, and I probably had some small amount of acne. And when you put it on your face, you could feel it was really abrasive and coarse. Looking back, that was surely one of these products which was just full of plastic. You're just rubbing it into your skin, which is probably ill-advised. So in many parts of the world, those are banned, but some of them are still out there. So doing a little bit of homework when it comes to skincare can probably make a difference in your exposure over time. Another factor related to that is the clothing that you wear. So plastics are used very widely in clothing. And so when you can, I'd say favor cotton clothes, for instance, over things that are made from polyester or whatever it might be. When it comes to the bedding that you use, like what you put on your duvet and your mattress, you might favor cotton or bamboo products as opposed to ones that are made using plastic. So that's another really easy swap. And what I said earlier about ventilating the room, that can help alter your exposure to plastic, because there's a lot of plastic and dust that sits around. And so keeping your room clean, vacuuming on a regular basis, swapping out the air periodically, all that kind of thing can add up. And then finally, just as a random source of exposure, and this is one that gets discussed quite a lot, so many people are already familiar with it, I'm sure. It's probably true of many of the things I mentioned, but receipts are often covered in a particular type of plastic. So just skip the receipt. You'll surely touch receipts now and then, you'll forget about it, but if you're checking out at the supermarket and you've got the option to deny the receipt, then just skip it. It's also good for the environment.
With the receipt and kind of clothing and maybe some of the products you put on your skin, are they coming in through the skin, or is it because they're going into the atmosphere and then you're breathing them in? Kind of, is it the touch element that's the problem?
I think it's both. I think there's probably a small amount of dermal absorption, but then also some of the plastics are being liberated, so they're moving from primary plastics into secondary plastics. So if you think about clothes, for instance, as you rub clothes against you, some of it will end up in the air, and then you could then breathe it in. So it's probably both.
And I think you mentioned it with the Tupperware. That's something I've made a recent switch to, is using glass. And unfortunately, the glass ones came with plastic lids. I don't know how often that like you can get fully glass ones. They're also way heavier and obviously can smash and break, and so aren't quite as easy in that regard. But at least if you are using the plastic Tupperware, I guess not microwaving. I think that's been a thing for a while, right? Not microwaving the plastics. That's probably going to liberate them even more. So not a smart move. And then one other one I've done, Greg, is shakers. So I use plastic shaker cup. Like,
Yeah.
I just use them as like a cup to drink from, like, all day. And so I've moved away from using plastic shaker cups to I bought some like metal ones essentially. A lot of those come with plastic lids and things. It can be a bit of a struggle to find ones with zero plastic. But some have silicone. So I just had the question, I don't know if you know if silicone is anywhere near to the point of which plastic, because it's very similar.
Yeah, I don't know, but obviously it's quite widespread, and it's not plastic. It is different. Is it very toxic in some of the same ways? I'm not sure. I've not looked into it, so it's a really good question. I also hadn't thought about shakers, so thanks for mentioning those. That's definitely something I'll consider, and that's very relevant to our audience today. But yeah, silicon, I don't know. I suspect that it's not benign. I mean, I've thought about that previously when it comes, of course, I've thought about this when it comes to breast implants. But if you think about breast implants, then they're getting broken down over time to some extent. Surely they must be. And I've heard some people say that they've had to have breast augmentation surgery multiple times because they've changed so much over time. what's happening to the silicon in those implants? I don't know, but it's not just vanishing. It must be getting broken down and then being redistributed elsewhere in the body, and then hopefully a lot of it's being excreted, but I'm sure that some of it's accumulating. So don't take what I have to say as some sort of gospel, because I've never looked for the research on that, but it's a really good question.
Yeah.
And when it comes to Tupperware and whatnot, I'm sure there are also lots of products that are out on the market that use things like stainless steel as alternatives. And maybe there are some metal-based options as opposed to glass-based ones that are less likely to break, but also lighter and therefore more practical to carry with you.
Yeah. The other one I was looking at was Ninja Creamy. I use that every night for ice cream. Thankfully, it's cold, so it's not hot stuff. But I was looking for containers that are at least metal instead of plastic. They don't sell those just yet. Maybe they will in future. I imagine if you've thought about silicone breast implants, you probably thought about tattoos as well, and that's something that
Yeah.
I kind of ignorance is bliss for me right now because I'm gradually becoming more covered and.
Mm.
It's already happened, but we haven't got a lot of research looking into that. I know there was you may have even seen it. There was a recent kind of, I guess it was like a scoping review or something like that. So we haven't got any definitive answers, but in some ways it's like it's going to break down, and where does it go?
Yeah, I'm sure. And I've not looked at that research, but I suspect that there'll be some forms of ink that are much more benign than others. And so for someone like you, Steve, if you're getting additional tattoos, then I'd try and do some homework and find out people who are actually experts in the subject, see what they have to say, and then you might have to pay a bit more to get tattoos done with a particular product, but it's probably worth it in the long term because they are surely being broken down. You see that in older adults who've had tattoos for decades.
Yeah, yeah, that's the get broken down into the lymphatic system, and then are they causing extra like potential cancer there? That's kind of the concern that's been highlighted. And man, they've been around for so long, and but it doesn't look like they've been particularly looked into to a high level. But I guess that's the same with like plastics, like you said, have been around. They've been around a heck of a long time, kind of looked into, but it's only recently it's becoming more broadly kind of publicly aware.
Yeah. But they're so widespread now that we've got to act really, really quickly because they're already everywhere and they're accumulating so quickly. This is a tangent, Steve, but I just thought of this. One recommendation I've made periodically, and will continue to make periodically, depending on the context, is using earplugs. And the earplugs that I personally have used a lot in recent years are silicone earplugs. And I like them because you can change the shape because people have different sized ears. Like I've got little baby ears, they're tiny. So for someone like me, I can't necessarily take an earplug off the shelf and it's going to fit well. And therefore, having something that I can mold is definitely a good thing. But those are surely being broken down. And so I have thought, well, that's not a good thing. If you speak with otolaryngologists, people, ENT doctors who study that part of the body, they tend to be quite anti-use of earplugs because a lot of people that they see will have had ear infections. And I was saying to you before we started recording that I'm currently in my seventh ear infection of the last 7 months because I love scuba diving and I'm an idiot. And so I never give my ears a long enough break and then I end up with another ear infection. And I think that part of the reason why I initially developed my first ear infection, and this is true of both ears now, is because I was using earplugs around the time that I was diving, and you need to give your ears a break and you need to let things drain out of your ears. And the nighttime is surely a time of day when that's important. So it's an example of something that I might once have recommended, but now probably changed my tune a little bit. And it's also potentially a small change that some people would make to lifestyle that's probably in their best interest in the long term because it's just not something I'd ever thought about until I started getting ear infections. And now I realize that there is actually a real trade-off there. And now we can couple that with the potential exposure to whatever the chemical that's used to make the earplug is.
Yeah, yeah, it's a great point, and I guess it's like science. You're updating your thoughts and beliefs on new science and lessons and learning, and continuing to do your best. And I guess as a final point, I think you'll be good to give people, the listeners, this in terms of microplastics and the negative impacts on health and everything that's going on there. Everything our general audience is doing in terms of regular resistance training, solid step counts, probably doing a bit of cardio or like at least something very similar, well-rounded, healthy diet in a good kind of body fat range, take care of their sleep. They're already, and I'm almost doing this for myself too, but doing so much good for their health that kind of, unless they're going out of their way to do something really negative with some of these things, and especially if they take on board some of the kind of small actionable things you mentioned that they can start doing, they shouldn't worry. Like you said, they could only control what they can, and they shouldn't worry about like that it's going to suddenly kill them tomorrow type of thing. I've made a bit of an extreme case, but I think you know where I'm going with this.
Yeah. Yeah, so what are some simple changes that people can make to their training in order to preserve their longevity?
Oh
Like
no,
some,
so I was just saying for the audience listening, in terms of microplastics and the negative impacts on their health, they're
yeah,
already doing so much of the basics right. They're already way
yeah,
ahead of most individuals that stressing is not, it's not really worth stressing much more than what you've already mentioned because we just don't know enough just yet.
yeah. And some of the things that I mentioned, like high dietary fiber intake, they're already doing. And many people are probably also sourcing higher quality foods that have been grown in better conditions if their finances allow that. So, yeah, I suspect many people are already doing things well, but there are probably simple changes that people can make, like stop using tea bags and go for loose leaf tea. And I think that in the next few years, there's going to be a massive change in that market because the world's waking up to the damaging effects of micro and nanoplastics. And so I think that whole industry is going to move away from plastic-based tea bags. And one of the confusing things is that some of the businesses that are out there that talk about having plastic-free tea bags are actually being disingenuous. And I don't want to sound like I'm conspiratorial or anything like that, but the reason is that they can make that claim, but technically their products do still contain plastics. So I remember looking into this when buying some green tea products a couple of years ago, and I bought some from the supermarket that claimed to have plastic-free tea bags, and then I looked into it and it was total nonsense. So if you're an avid tea consumer, get loose leaf tea and use a metal tea strainer when preparing your tea if you can. And then other simple changes like cutting out the chewing gum. When you buy new clothes now, pay attention to what the fabrics are. Same with bedding, not heating plastics, avoiding consuming food from plastics and using plastics in your cookware in general, like if you've got plastic chopping boards or whatever, and you're cutting into them and then those are liberating plastic. Just some of those simple changes you can accrue over time. You don't have to change everything today and go out and spend thousands of pounds. But instead, when you're looking to replace something you're already doing, because it's reached the end of its life cycle, just go for a better alternative next time.
Well said, Greg. I think that's a wrap. Really enjoyed talking through these subjects with you, Greg, and I think people are going to be better off and healthier taking on board this advice and moving it forward with themselves. So thank you so much for your time. You mentioned your podcast a few times, but I should definitely tell the audience where that is, where they can find you, so they can keep up to date.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. It's reason and well-being. The and is an ampersand, which is probably an error in retrospect. But yeah, reason and well-being, you can find it wherever you find podcasts. And then YouTube channel corresponding to that is at Greg Potter PhD, which is also my handle on Instagram and LinkedIn. If anyone's got any questions, wants to get in touch, then please do so.
Fantastic. I'll make sure that's linked in the description. And guys, we'll catch you on the next episode. Take care.